So sort of the interlude between nutrition and child development. When you go to nutrition conferences, you often hear people talk of the first 1,000 days, and we've heard that term many times today. And then you often hear them present, data showing sort of the pattern that happens with stunting and child growth, and arguing that that's the reason we focus on the first 1,000 days. I see it a little bit differently. I think the main reason to focus on the first 1,000 days is because that's when brain development is happening. During the first 1,000 days, 80% of the brain development that happens occurs during the first 1,000 days. 700 synapses are formed per second. So it's really a critical time to focus as far as nutritional interventions, as far as early childhood development interventions, because that's when the brain is being formed. And the way that the wiring of the brain happens, it's similar to if you're building a house. Or you're wiring a house. You first build down sort of the basic infrastructure. You're building the basic wiring, and then over time, due to pruning and other processes that are happening, you're laying sort of the more complicated infrastructure on top of that, the architecture. So from the time of conception through childhood, increasingly complicated parts of the brain are sort of being built. So this is the reason I think we focus on the first 1,000 days. Now, stunting is also important. People who are taller as adults do make more money. They do tend to be more educated. But that's not the reason. I think the real reason that we're focusing on it is because of brain development. And the first year of life is critical. So there have been various estimates that have been put out there as to how many children are at risk of not fulfilling their developmental potential. There was an estimate as part of the Lancet series on early childhood development in 2007 that there were 200 million children not fulfilling their developmental potential. More recently, just this month actually, in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, some colleagues at Harvard had come out with an estimate of the economic cost and the cost in terms of schooling that's mediated through growth faltering, basically. In South Asia alone, South Asia leads the world actually in terms of the economic costs of growth faltering. $46.6 billion per birth cohort due to growth faltering. Huge implications for economic development. This is why we're focusing on nutrition. Now, stunting, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is not the whole story. I think there's a real need to have field-friendly childhood development measures that we can use as part of surveys to understand the full, true costs and to measure the effective interventions, especially as we move towards having sort of joint nutrition and early childhood development programs joined together. And the home environment is acknowledged to be a really important contributor to early childhood development, but it's not really been studied that much. In fact, in looking through the literature and just searching for papers that have studied food insecurity and the risks that food insecurity at the household level plays in terms of increasing the risk of adverse child development indicators, I found only one study, and it wasn't even in a peer-reviewed paper. There's a study from Arkansas, actually, that showed the increased risk associated with food insecurity on different outcomes, including developmental delays. You can see there is the third group. But in the peer-reviewed literature, it's kind of astounding to me. There's really very little quantification of the effect that being food insecure has on the development of children. So the study aims here were to explore in a cohort that we have going on in Bhaktapur, which is a peri-urban area in Kathmandu Valley, explore this linkage between food insecurity, between dietary quality, and also child development. And we had two hypotheses. One was just that children who are living in families with higher food insecurity would be at greater risk of adverse child development outcomes. And then the second would be that there's something extra going on here, that this association, even after you control for nutritional status, dietary quality, that food insecurity would still be an important predictor, even after adjusting for those other exposures. So this was a cross-sectional study among 305 children. We had started following them up soon after birth, but this is only a cross-sectional follow-up of the children that we had remaining in the cohort as they reached about 6 years of age. So these are sort of older children who just were leaving their preschool years, just starting school. We assessed child development using the Ages and Stages questionnaire. And I'll tell you a little bit about that questionnaire and the approach we used in a second. We treated our outcome measures in two different ways, both as a continuous variable, and then also we just took the bottom quartile of children who had the lowest child development scores, and that was another outcome. A couple main exposures. One was the household food insecurity access score, and we divided that in different ways, which I'll show you. And then also a measure of household dietary diversity. We used a theory-based approach to selection of potential confounders and covariates, which you can see listed there. And then we used two different ways to analyze this, both logistic regression and then linear regression. So here's the approach that we use to measure food insecurity, very commonly used tool, validated in multiple settings. There's the household food insecurity access scale, which is a continuous exposure. We looked at that, but I'm not presenting that today. Instead I'm presenting it by category because I think that's a little easier to interpret. And so we basically, after summing these 9 different questions, you sort of divide the results into 4 different categories. And so ranging from severely food insecure all the way up through food secure. Household dietary diversity was measured also using a very commonly used tool, which is from FAO, and the score ranged from 0 to 12. It's basically summing the total number of different categories of food in the household consumed in the past 24 hours. So the Ages and Stages questionnaire was originally developed, I think, it's been developed over the past 40 years, actually. It was originally developed in the United States, but it's been tested and validated in many settings throughout the world. I think this is the first time, the work that we've been doing is the first time that it's been used in Nepal, but it has been used in India and other settings throughout the world. Its virtue is in its simplicity. So it consists of 30 different questions, which can either be asked to the caretaker or the parents, or can be done through observation. And these 30 questions fall within 5 different subscales of development there. You can see problem solving, communication, gross motor, fine motor, and personal social. So you can examine each of those separately and then pull them together to create a total score of child development. So here you can see sort of an example questionnaire. This is the one for gross motor. Basically asking questions like, does your child catch a large ball with both hands? So the parent could either answer that and say yes, or sometimes, or not yet, or the person who's doing the observing can actually throw the ball to the child and then see if the child catches it. Give them a couple tries, especially if they're not familiar with that activity. So here's some descriptive characteristics of the population. I don't want to dwell on this one too much, just to say that, as you would expect, households that are more food insecure also, have higher rates of stunting. Their SES score is also worse. It's what you might expect. You can see in the first model here, this is adjusting for age only, that for each category that you move up from food secure through food insecure, the risk of having an adverse child development outcome increases by 40%, and that's significant. And even after you adjust for stunting, it remains significant, so it's a 37% greater risk per category increase. And even after you adjust for other things like socioeconomic status and household dietary diversity, it also remains significant. All of those variables were also significant in their own right. And so our second hypothesis also was consistent with what we observed here. I'll skip the continuous, but we also saw very similar results there as well. As I said, our findings were consistent with our hypotheses that food insecurity places children at greater risk for adverse developmental outcomes. These associations, I would say, also suggest that there's construct validity of this tool. And so some of the other work that we've been doing as part of our work for the Nutrition Innovation Lab, in collaboration with Heifer and Tufts University, has been piloting this ages and stages questionnaire in a rural area as well, in rural Banki, Nepal, as part of a home-based tool. This was done in a clinical environment. And if you want to check out our poster later today or tomorrow, you can see the results from that. But we're getting pretty good. I mean, I think the tool is working pretty well. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to administer. It was administered as part of a full sort of survey. And I think it worked pretty well. There's still a little bit of room for improvement. So pathways. So I think, what does this study add? Well, traditionally we sort of, I think, see nutritional status as the end result of the pathway. I think what this sort of can be used to argue is that we should be thinking beyond nutritional status, perhaps. We should think about why we're interested in nutritional status. Sometimes it's because of health or increased mortality, but the other angle that's becoming more important now that child mortality is dropping is children's brain development and learning and income potential, right? So perhaps if we separate out nutritional status from child development, obviously they're very interrelated, but if you view it from that perspective, what this adds then is perhaps a new pathway, making it even more complicated, from food security to child development, and then that pathway from child development to learning and income potential. Strengths of the study: it's a large sample size for this type of work. You know, I think in this type of work, often the sample sizes are like 100 or 150 children. This was over 300 children, which for this type of work is quite large. And we also had a large sample size of older children. Limitations, as Kendall said earlier, cross-sectional study limits our understanding of causality or of temporal relations here. Some of the children exceeded the upper range that's recommended for the tool, but we don't expect that that would introduce bias to our results. There's always the possibility of unmeasured confounding and also generalizability, the question of whether or not children in Bhaktapur represent the rest of the country. We can try to explore that in future studies in Nepal. So as far as future research directions, I think we need to continue to work to develop this tool. And to field test it in rural Nepal and adapt some of the questions to continue to improve it. I think it would be nice to integrate this into some of the impact evaluations like those that you've seen today, you know, to see whether or not perhaps we're underestimating the impact if we use stunting alone. Maybe there could be pathways that are not mediated by stunting through which we could achieve, you know, a change in child developmental outcomes. And also, if you're striving towards a change in child developmental outcomes rather than stunting, it would also sort of support that argument that we should be doing stimulation and early childhood development as part of an integrated package. So, yeah, thank you all for listening.